We're talking about this phrase, all in, as a church. It's the name of the series that we're doing. It's an initiative really over our entire church and every ministry environment. And if you missed last week, we took a second and tried to figure out, where did this phrase come from? It's a phrase that we hear all the time. Maybe you've heard it in sports before. Maybe you've heard a political candidate say it, or maybe even in your own kind of everyday conversation. I know for me, a couple weeks ago, we'd had a really long day of parenting, and if you're a parent, you know what I mean. And so we just went and got pizza for dinner, make things a little bit simpler, and I thought about how I was feeling, how the day had been. I looked at the Papa John's box, and I said, I'm about to go all in on this Papa John's. And I did, and I was really happy about that. I committed everything I had. I was really grateful. But that phrase has become just part of our culture, part of our pop culture. And really, we can trace it back to about 20 years ago. There's this phenomenon called the World Series of Poker, where I know none of you know anything about gambling, but just so you know, there was something called Texas Hold'em, and there was this moment in playing Texas Hold'em where players would push their chips to the middle of the table and they would say, all in, or I'm all in, or I'm going all in, and it became a really exciting moment in the actual World Series of Poker because there was no turning back for this person. They committed everything they had, and that phrase really took off and now has become just something that we understand as any moment in life where you have to commit all of who you are. You have to commit everything you have to someone or something, and many of us know what that's like in different areas of our life, different arenas of our life. And what we're doing in this series is we're just taking that same idea and we're asking the question, what would it look like if we applied the same thing to our relationship with God? In fact, the tagline of this series is really simple. To go all in means to be fully surrendered to Jesus. What would that mean for you in 2024, to be all in and fully surrendered to Jesus? Now, if you've been following Jesus, doesn't matter if it's just a year or your entire life or however, if you just started a relationship with Jesus, doesn't matter. Anybody who follows Jesus knows that over time, there are different areas of life that we surrender to him. In fact, some of you, maybe you've joined a group in the last couple of weeks and you're gonna meet your group tonight for the first time. And in a way, you're kind of surrendering your relationships to God in that way. For some of you, you know what it's like to surrender your marriage to God, your job to him, your children to him. But oftentimes, the last piece of our life, the last thing in our life, and often the hardest part of life to surrender to Jesus is our money. And anytime the word money comes on the screen in church, or you hear church talk about money, it's for everybody. All of us, there's something that happens in us. There's a response that's coming up inside you right now, especially if this is your first Sunday here with us this year, or you've missed the last couple of weeks. Anytime money goes on the screen and the church starts talking about money, there's a response that all of you have. And I understand that. Some of you have given me your responses, and I hear you. And in fact, if I had your experience, if I had your church experience, I probably would feel the same way. But I just want to remind all of us and get us all on the same page about something. We're not doing this series because our church is in a dire place financially. That's not why we're doing this. We're not doing this series because we're in a building campaign. We're not doing this series as a capital campaign. And I know it's hard to believe. We're not doing this series so Sean can have a hot tub in his office. That's not why we're doing the series. We're simply doing this series because Jesus taught really clearly that your heart and your money are connected. And if that's true, and we believe it is, then what does God have to say about how to handle our money? Because just to catch you up, in week one, Sean talked about this. He said, look, Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 6, his most famous sermon of all time, the Sermon on the Mount. He taught in Matthew chapter 6 that if your heart goes after money, and that's where your commitment is, in a sense, that's what you go all in with, don't be surprised if money starts to control you. Jesus taught that where your heart is, where your treasure is, where your money is, there your heart will be also. And last week, I got to teach a little bit about often one of the biggest roadblocks, the biggest hindrances, if you will, for many of us to trusting God with our money is the issue of trust that's based in fear. And today I want to talk about another thing. another specific roadblock, another specific hurdle that really holds a lot of us back from going all in and surrendering our money to Jesus, and that's this issue of perspective. And so I want to talk about perspective for a second, how you view things. But specifically, I don't want to talk about it in a general sense. I want to get really specific this morning. I want to talk about your perspective on money. We all have one. When money comes to mind, there's things that roll through our brain. We all have a view on money, and it's been influenced by so many different things and experiences in our life. Your perspective on money was influenced by the family you grew up in. It was. Your perspective on money is influenced by the community that's around you. It's influenced by the culture that we live in. Your perspective on money, this is true for everybody. It's influenced by the ups and downs of your experiences with money. That's just true. But I actually think that the perspective you and I have on money is really powerful in a very crucial way. And that's because whether you've realized it or not, your perspective determines your priorities. You ever thought about this? Your perspective, how you view something, it determines your priorities. In other words, how you view things determines how you do things. Your perspective determines your priorities. And when we think about the different areas of our life, if you came into this year and you wanted to be a little bit healthier, maybe lose some weight or rethink your nutrition, how you prioritize that area of your life is what's ultimately going to get you what you want. Well, the same's true with our finances. How we prioritize financially is exactly and uniquely designed to get us what we want. And because we're all human, every one of us, if I were to ask you, hey, what do you want financially in your life? What are you looking for? What are you hoping for? Well, the low-hanging fruit, the answer that'd be the easiest for us is, we just want more money. We want more of it. That's what we ultimately want. That's what I want. That's what you want. But I actually think it's deeper than that. I think there's something under this desire for more money that's just very normal for all of us. I think the thing that's underneath that desire is ultimately what we do want, and that's this thing, it's security. I think we all crave financial security for good reason. We want to know, do I have enough, or am I okay, and am I going to be okay? And so when it comes to this idea of security, I just want to ask a couple of questions to get us started this morning. I'm gonna put these on the screen. I just want them to land hopefully in a place where you're just maybe thinking through this as we talk this morning. But the first question is this: to what degree do you view money as a source of security? Notice I didn't ask, do you view money as a source of security? Because we all do. We're saying the quiet part out loud there. But to what degree do you view money as a source of security? And then secondly, maybe a little more challenging, how much is enough to make you feel secure? How much is enough to make you feel secure? What do we do with that? That's a tension that we all have to wrestle with this morning. And last week, I mentioned this, but it's just so encouraging to me, so I want to mention it again. We are not the first generation of people to wrestle with these questions. We're not the first generation of people to try to figure out, hey, how do I deal with all this? I've got financial fear. I've got financial insecurity and worries. And how do I go through life knowing that I'm going to have enough, be enough, make enough, all of that? We're not the first generation to do that. In fact, it's been so prevalent for so long. Jesus actually taught on these very things as he walked on earth. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at a story that Jesus taught in Luke chapter 12. It's a story that he told. Jesus often taught the crowds in something called parables. And a parable was a made-up story to get across a certain point that Jesus was trying to make. And in Luke chapter 12, he tells a really interesting story, a really interesting parable. And so if you have your all-in booklet, you can turn to page 18. It's written out there for you. There's a space to write notes there as well. But we pick it up in verse 13, and let me give you a little bit of context and kind of help you get the picture of what's going on here. Jesus is teaching the crowd, he's teaching his disciples, and then somebody shouts out a request to Jesus. And I actually believe that this maybe happened more than we realize, because Jesus was constantly surrounded by crowds. People were always bringing him questions and concerns and thoughts, and hey, what about this and what about that? And I actually believe this probably happened more often than we realize, where someone just shouts something out from the crowd, maybe in the middle of Jesus' teaching. But in this particular case, Jesus actually stops and answers the guy. And so we pick it up in Luke chapter 12, verse 13, and I want to read it for us. It'll be up on the screen as well. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God." There's a lot to unpack there. The first thing, I want to point out a couple of things in the story. The first thing is, anytime I'm reading the scriptures and God calls somebody a fool, I don't know about you, I just kind of pay attention a little more. It's probably a good practice. And so as I was reading this and studying this, I was really asking the Lord, why is this man a fool? Why does he call him a fool? And you know, the more that I read and thought through it, and it felt like God was showing me for some things this morning, he wasn't foolish for having a lot. He was foolish because of what he chose to do with it. He wasn't foolish for having a lot. He was just foolish for what he chose to do with it. Jesus says the ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He didn't call him a fool for being rich. It was what he chose to do with it. And what he chose to do with it tells us a lot about his priorities in life. And what he prioritized was the good life. He prioritized this life that he wanted for himself, with as least amount of work and as much amount of comfort as possible. And that's just such a strong desire for all of us. And this man, Jesus says, look, he prioritized his life around securing that life for himself. But he learned something that so many of us maybe have already learned or in the middle of learning right now, and that's the good life doesn't last. If that's the prioritization of our life financially, that actually doesn't last. And Jesus says he was a fool because he prioritized the temporary. He prioritized the temporary. And not only that, but as we study this passage, I think another thing that's interesting to me as we read this passage is when we kind of dig into this man's priorities, if your perspective informs and determines your priorities, this story leads us to believe and understand that your priorities actually lead you to what you become. If how I see things is going to determine my priorities in life, if my perspective determines my priorities, then over time, the priorities that I have, it's going to lead me to what I ultimately become. Here's how that process works. How you see is kind of how it begins. How you see leads you to how you act. How you see leads you to how you act, and then ultimately that leads you to what you become. How you see leads you to how you act, which leads you to what you become. And so how did that process go for this rich man that Jesus tells a story about? Well, his perspective, I think as we dig into it, what his perspective was, is he saw as an owner. That was his perspective. He saw money as mine and mine alone. I own it, it belongs to me, it's mine. And notice the word choice, my crops. What am I gonna do with my surplus grain? He saw as an owner, which is very easy for many of us to do. Maybe you've been there, I know I've been there. But if you've ever been in that perspective before financially, what you might have come to realize and what we know to be true is that when you see money as mine and mine alone, if it's all for me, then producing it also depends all on me. You see that? If it's all for me, then producing it is all on me too. And so this man, he saw as an owner, it's mine and mine alone, but that led him to act a certain way. That led him to act out of scarcity. When we see as an owner, it leads us to act out of scarcity. Notice that he says, what am I gonna do? I'll have to build bigger barns, which insinuates that he actually already had barns to begin with. That was enough for whatever life he had secured for himself. But now that he's got more, he doesn't want to do anything other than keep it to himself, and he acts out of scarcity and builds bigger barns. How you see leads you to how you act, which then leads you to how you ultimately become. And God tells him, and Jesus mentions to us in the story, that he became greedy. That's what he ultimately became. He became greedy. He saw as an owner, he acted out of scarcity, and he became greedy. Now, I understand. Greed is the last word that we want to see on a screen. It's not a fun word to say out loud. It's actually extremely hard to see greed in the mirror. But all greed is a never-ending, self-serving desire for more. That's the definition of greed. An unending, self-serving desire for more. And Jesus tells us in the story, hey, his perspective led him to his actions, which led him to become greedy. And so, when you're reading the scriptures, sometimes it's helpful to think through it this way. Put yourself in the crowd for a second. You're on the other side of Jesus teaching this revolutionary concept about money and how to use it and what to do with more than what you have and all this stuff that maybe they had never heard before. Put yourself in the crowd for a second. And when you get to the conclusion that the way that he saw led him to how he acted, to ultimately he became greedy, if you're like me, I'm in the crowd and I'm going, well, I don't want to be greedy. I don't know what the alternative is, but I don't really want to be known as a greedy person. So Jesus, I hope you have more for me than this. And luckily for us, he does. Because he doesn't shift and change directions. He just keeps going. And in verse 22, the very next sentence, he says this, we'll have it on the screens. Then Jesus said to the disciples, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable are you than birds? Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life? And I love this. Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? He goes on, consider how the wildflowers grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? And do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it. For the pagan world runs after all such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. And then he lands the plane like this. Do not be afraid, little flock. For your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. And here it is. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Jesus says there's two paths here. There's the way of the world, which he demonstrated in the parable of what my Bible calls the rich fool. The way of the world is to prioritize around the temporary. But then there's the way of Jesus that we just read through, and Jesus says, hey, if you want to follow after me, especially in the financial area of your life, it's going to require that you prioritize around eternity. The way of the world is to prioritize around the temporary. The way of Jesus, going all in and following him, being fully surrendered to him, is to prioritize around eternity. So if you're like me, you're asking in the crowd, you're going, well, what does that look like? Remember, it starts with our perspective, which leads to our priorities, which leads to what we ultimately become. And when we prioritize around eternity, our perspective changes. And when that happens, we don't see as an owner, we now see as a manager. We see as a manager. In other words, we see that everything comes from God, even financial provision. That those are a gift from God to me, and it is my job, my perspective on that is to manage what he has given me for whatever time he's given me to manage it. When we see as a manager instead of an owner, it leads us to act not out of scarcity, but out of abundance. Now, I'm not saying in any way that as we prioritize around eternity, when I say act out of abundance, that God is going to abundantly bless you financially. That's not the message I'm saying this morning. What I am saying is this. When we see as a manager, when we have perspective that allows us to prioritize around eternity, we act out of abundance because, here it is, we realize if it's all from God, there's no end to God's ability to provide for me. That is abundance. And if security is what we want financially, which I would say for many, if not all of us, that's ultimately what we want. What's more secure than that? To know that there's no end to his ability to provide for my every need. That allows you and me not to act out of scarcity anymore, but to live a life acting out of abundance, knowing that God, the creator of the universe, who loves me and sent his son for me, is able to provide every single thing I need, including financial. And if how we see leads us to how we act, when we prioritize around eternity, what we ultimately become is not greedy, we become generous. And so the bottom line this morning is really simple. It's this: when we prioritize around eternity, we become generous. When we prioritize around eternity, we become generous. Now, if Jesus presents two paths here, the way of the world to prioritize around the temporary, the way of Jesus to prioritize around eternity, and he says, in one of those scenarios, the possibility for it to be destroyed is very real. The possibility for it to be stolen is very real, but in the other scenario, it's not. In one scenario, it's going to be left behind. In another, it's not going to be left behind. When we hear that, the question that we've got to ask is, why don't we do this more? Why don't we prioritize around eternity? Until we can answer that question, it's going to be really hard to actually do it. And there's so many reasons, there's so many things, and probably so many of you would have different reasons and experiences and history, and I understand that. But I think for many of us, myself included, sometimes what makes this really hard is that we actually, when we think about having an eternal perspective, what makes this really hard is we actually don't believe heaven's going to be better than earth. That's what makes it hard. Do we really believe that the eternal reality that Jesus talks about is going to be better than the present possibility of this life? And there's so many ways and directions we could go with that. And this morning, I just want to get us back kind of on the same page and just say this: heaven is for real. It's not an imagined place. It is a real place that Jesus in John chapter 14 said, I am going somewhere to prepare a place for you. He's telling his disciples, he says, I'm going somewhere to prepare a place for you. In my Father's house, there are many rooms. If it wasn't that way, would I have told you it would be so? Heaven's a real place. We believe that the Bible teaches there's an eternity with God or there's an eternity without God. And just so you know, eternity with God, it's gonna look a lot like this. The Apostle John wrote this in Revelation 21, and just listen to this for a second. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Then he said, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. Heaven is for real. And I think there's something in you that you want it to be real. You don't want it to be just an imagined thing out there in the ether. You want it to be a real place, and it is. Solomon, in all his wisdom, in the book of Ecclesiastes, he said this, he said that he had come to realize that the Lord had set eternity in the human heart. And there's something in you and there's something in me that desires this unity with God with no barrier between anymore, this no sin to divide our intimacy and relationship with God. We want to dwell with God forever. Randy Alcorn, in his book on heaven, says it this way. We long for what the first man and woman once enjoyed, a perfect and beautiful earth with free and untainted relationships with God. Every attempt at human progress has been an attempt to overcome what was lost in the fall. And Jesus' teaching tells us this. There's one path of prioritizing around the temporary, where you lay up treasures for yourself, and the other is prioritizing around the eternity, where you lay up treasures in heaven, a real place where you are really going if you're a Jesus follower and you're a Christian. And one of those you leave behind, and one of those you don't. In this series, we've filmed a variety of videos of people in our church who have gone all in financially, who have trusted God with their finances, who have surrendered financially to God. And we've done this in a variety of ways. One, to inspire you, yes, but also to make you feel like this thing that can often be scary and confusing or overwhelming feel very doable and achievable. And this morning, I want to introduce you to my friends, George and Georgie, and their journey of going all in. I want you to pay attention to how their journey of going all in has led them to a perspective and a prioritizing around eternity. Take a look at the screens.
I'm Georgie Bullock, and this is my husband, George. And yes, we are George and Georgie from Georgia. I am recently retired, 35 years in public education.
And I am in my 34th year also in public education.
And we've been attending Athens Church for going about 7 years.
We decided to go all in financially early in our marriage. I remember us discussing how we were going to handle what we felt like was a step of obedience. Both of us had very good examples growing up. I remember seeing my dad weekly write the check to the church, and her parents were just the epitome of stewardship on every aspect of their life. But just because sometimes you have great examples doesn't mean you have follow through. So through what I believe was good discussion, prayer, and a sense of trust, we decided that was just going to be something we did. Not that it was always easy, or it is still not always easy. I felt like that we early on put that as a priority and made that decision within the first few weeks of our marriage.
It has definitely been a commitment and a struggle at times, especially when we got, to the point of retiring. Some finances changed a little bit, so we had to make some decisions. But, there are sometimes we would think to each other, you know what, if we don't tithe these next couple months, we might be able to go on this vacation, or we might be able to buy this certain things we want, or we might be able to pay off some bills that we need to pay off. But I can honestly say, through the work of the Holy Spirit and prayer and conversation, we never did, yield to that temptation. We still stuck to the course, because in our hearts we realize it's not ours to begin with. So we've always been faithful. We're not rich by any means, but we've made some poor financial decisions in our lifetime. But God has always been faithful, even though we've done that, to prove to us over and over that He's got us as long as we are willing to commit to Him and we are faithful to Him. And we've seen Him do that so many times that we can't start now by stepping back.
I felt like that was one area that we did not have to spend as much time worrying about, because it was going to be taken care of regardless of what happened. Even if it was not to our liking, we would find, or He would show us a path that we were able to get through it.
To anyone who hasn't trusted God with your finances, I would tell you this. It is not an easy thing to do, but I think the first step is just to really come to understand that it's really not ours to begin with. It all belongs to God. God has blessed us with money, with financial, means. And it's just an act of obedience. It truly is an act of obedience, just to say, I'm going to give Him back what belongs to Him. He's going to give you a peace that you just don't understand, but it's there. He may not always bless you financially, but He's going to bless you in ways that you have just no way of comprehending. Just do it. Just take that step, and I promise you will not regret it. But you got to just take that first step.
And it's one that we have to make not just one and done. It is often frequently revisited. One, as a reminder that we are not in control, that it is God's, but it's also that it's not just coming down to money, it is coming down to obedience.
My favorite thing about George and Georgie is they are taking care of my kids right now in Upstreet, and have faithfully served down there for so many years. So how do you do it? How do we actually prioritize around eternity? Well, we know how to prioritize around the temporary, because this is so common for our world and our culture. Our culture would say, the world would say, when it comes to your money, do whatever you need to do to live off of what you need to live first. Then if there's anything left over after that, after you've secured kind of the life that you want and need, save a little bit. And then if there's anything left over after that, maybe you should give. That's what prioritizing around the temporary looks like. But prioritizing around eternity means we give first, save second, and then live off the rest. Remember what we said in the beginning and what we said every week. There is a direct connection Jesus taught between your heart and your money. And what would happen for you if you walked out of here with an eternal perspective that allowed you and led you to prioritize around eternity, and instead of giving of what's left over, you then gave first? And every month or twice a month or whenever you got paid, the first thing you did financially was return back to God what He's given you to begin with. You saw as a manager, and it led you to act out of abundance, and then you become generous and you give first. And this card is a tool that we've helped you, or we've designed to help you in that journey. There's actually a step on this card called a priority giver. As you've studied this over the last couple of weeks, hopefully it's helped you identify kind of where you are in this journey, but also maybe the step of obedience that God wants you to take in becoming a priority giver. For us, that means returning 10% of our income back to God through the local church. And you can set that up so that you give first. And in doing so, your heart, which is connected to your treasure, is returned every time you get paid back to God, to his provision, to his abundance. Imagine what life would be like if you did that. What we're gonna do right now is the band's gonna come and sing a song, and this is a song that I have been tracking with for a few weeks, and it essentially has become a prayer of my heart, and I hope it becomes a prayer of your heart today as well. It's written as a prayer, and the message of this song directly speaks to what we're talking, not just today, but really every week this series. And so as you hear this song, I want you to pay attention to this one particular line, this one phrase. But it says, I'm learning how to trust you. I'm learning how to let it go. Because when I learn to let it go, I'm never more sure that this is in better hands than my own. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you that you provide everything that we need. Jesus, thank you for teaching us about money so many years ago and how it still resonates for our life today. Thank you for the opportunity to have an eternal mindset, to have a perspective on eternity, to prioritize around eternity, where we can become generous. And the first thing that we do financially every month or whenever money comes in is to return that back to you through generosity, by making it a priority. Would you speak to our hearts now? I pray you would open our hearts to become generous, but to prioritize around an eternity that is real, that you are preparing for us now. And may we lay up treasure there where none of it can be destroyed, none of it can be stolen. In your name we pray, amen.